The night I realized my family had already decided my future without me was the night my name disappeared from a seating chart. Not a will, not a contract. A seating chart. I was standing in the hallway outside the private dining room at the Ashford Hotel in Charleston, staring at a cream-colored board mounted on an easel. Names printed in elegant serif font. Tables arranged by importance. Proximity measured in feet and meaning. My parents' names were there. My sister's name was there. My brother-in-law's name was there. Mine was not. For a moment, I assumed it was a mistake. The kind of oversight that happens when weddings get large and planners get overwhelmed. I took out my phone, refreshed the email with the seating details, checked my spam folder like that might explain the absence. Nothing. I looked around, expecting someone to call my name, to wave me over, to explain. No one did. That was the moment the open loop began, even if I didn't know the shape of it yet. My name is Nora Whitman. I was 32 years old that winter. I worked in compliance for a regional healthcare company, the kind of job that teaches you how systems break quietly, how rules are bent without being shattered, how paperwork becomes a weapon when people know how to use it. I'd flown in from Chicago that morning for my younger sister Elise's engagement dinner. A small, intimate affair, my mother had said. Just family and a few close friends. Apparently, I didn't qualify. I found a staff member and asked if there was another list. She checked her tablet, frowned politely, then said something I would replay in my head for months. Oh, you're marked as flexible seating. Flexible. That was the first word they used to erase me. I was eventually placed at a side table near the service corridor, close enough to hear laughter, far enough to be irrelevant. Elise never looked over. Neither did my parents. My father, Martin Whitman, sat at the center of the room like a man who believed proximity equaled authority. My mother, Claire, leaned in beside him, smiling the way she always did when everything was going according to plan. My brother Aaron clinked glasses with Elise's fiancé, Trevor Hale, a real estate developer with the kind of confidence that came from inherited money and well-timed silence. I watched. I observed. I said nothing. That was my role in this family. The quiet one, the capable one. The one who handled things behind the scenes without being acknowledged for it. I'd been that way since childhood. At Thanksgiving dinners where my birthday was forgotten because it fell too close to the holiday. At Christmas mornings where my gifts were practical, while Elise's were aspirational. At family meetings where decisions were announced, never discussed. Still, I had believed something naive. That being reliable earned you security. I learned that night how wrong I was. Halfway through dessert, my mother stood to give a toast. She spoke about family, about unity, about how proud she was of the way we supported one another. Her eyes passed over me without pause. Applause followed. I clapped too, quietly. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Aaron. You should probably leave early. Dad doesn't want tension tonight. I stared at the message. What tension? I typed back. His reply came almost immediately. Exactly. I left without saying goodbye. In the cab back to my hotel, I replayed the evening in fragments. The missing name, the word flexible, the way no one intervened, the ease with which they adjusted to my absence. By the time I reached my room, something had shifted. Not anger, clarity. I opened my laptop and logged into the family business portal. Whitman Coastal Holdings, the LLC my parents had formed years ago to manage rental properties along the Carolina coast. The one I'd helped organize. The one I'd written policies for. The one I was not officially listed as an owner of, despite contributing unpaid labor for nearly a decade. I hadn't checked the back-end permissions in months. I did now. That was when I saw it. A change request filed 3 weeks earlier. Approved. Ownership percentages adjusted. My name still appeared in the audit history, but my access had been downgraded. Observer only. No voting rights. No authority. Just visibility. They hadn't told me. They hadn't asked. They had simply decided. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. This wasn't favoritism. It was strategy. And I was the variable they'd decided to control. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront my parents or my sister or my brother. I did what I always did. I took notes. Because when people move against you quietly, The only way to survive is to get quieter than them. And I already knew exactly where to start. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, the room still dark and unfamiliar. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the weight of the night before settled back into place, heavy and precise. I didn't rush. That was new for me. In the past, I would have filled the silence with action. Phone calls, messages, attempts to clarify, to smooth things over, to make sure no one was uncomfortable with my discomfort. Instead, I made coffee in the hotel room and sat by the window, watching Charleston wake up. By the time my parents texted, I already knew what they would say. My mother's message arrived first. Hope you got back to your hotel safely. Yesterday was a bit hectic. My father followed an hour later. We'll talk when things settle down. Neither asked if I was hurt. Neither mentioned the seating. Neither acknowledged the change in the company records. They weren't avoiding the topic. They were waiting for me to let it go. I didn't reply. At the airport, while waiting for my flight back to Chicago, I logged into Whitman Coastal Holdings again. Slowly this time. Carefully. The changes hadn't been sloppy. That impressed me in a way I didn't like. My access had been reduced in stages. First, removal from decision notifications. Then, revocation of approval authority. Finally, a reclassification of my role from administrative contributor to external consultant. External. As if I hadn't spent years coordinating maintenance schedules, reconciling accounts, drafting tenant communications, and flagging compliance issues before they became expensive problems. I pulled the audit logs. The request had been submitted by my father, approved by my mother, witnessed digitally by Aaron. Elise's name wasn't on it, which meant one of two things. Either they hadn't told her, or they had, and she'd chosen not to touch it. Both possibilities sat badly with me. Back in Chicago, life resumed its usual rhythm. Meetings, reports, quiet lunches at my desk. Colleagues who knew me as efficient and reliable, not someone's daughter or sister. That contrast sharpened my focus. At work, my role existed because of my competence. At home, my value existed only when it was convenient. A week passed. Then 2. No one brought it up. At the end of the second week, my father called. "Nora," he said, brisk as ever, "we need to get aligned." "On what?" I asked. "The business," he replied. "There have been some structural changes, I noticed," I said. A pause. "You're not involved day to day anymore," he continued, as if explaining a natural occurrence. "It makes things simpler." "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone," he said. "You live out of state. You have your own career. This takes pressure off you." Pressure. That word again. "You removed my voting rights," I said evenly. "That's not taking pressure off. That's removing agency." "Nora," he sighed, "you're being emotional." I almost smiled. "I work in compliance," I said. "Emotion doesn't factor into access control." He didn't respond immediately. "You've always been good with details," he said finally. "That's why we'll still need your help occasionally." Help. Without authority. Without acknowledgement. Without protection. "No," I said. The word hung between us, unfamiliar and solid. "No," he repeated. "I'm not helping informally," I continued. "Not without formal standing. That's not how family works," he said. "That's exactly how business works," I replied. "And you made it business." He ended the call shortly after. That night, I received a text from Elise. "Dad says you're upset. Is everything okay?" I read it 3 times before responding. "I'm fine," I typed. "I just wasn't consulted about some decisions." She replied a minute later. "I'm sure they had reasons." That was it. No question. No curiosity. No concern. I set my phone down and stared at the ceiling. That was when it clicked. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a gradual narrowing. Every time I'd accepted being left out of conversations. Every time I'd smoothed over discomfort instead of naming it. Every time I told myself it didn't matter. They'd been taking notes too. They'd learned I wouldn't push back. Until now. The following Friday, I took a personal day and visited a law office recommended by a colleague. Not a family friend. Not someone connected to Charleston. A woman named Dana Morales who specialized in corporate governance and family-held entities. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Did you ever sign an operating agreement?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "years ago. when the LLC was formed. And were you listed as a member? She asked. Yes, she nodded slowly. Then they can't do what they did without your consent. I felt something tighten in my chest. They already did, I said. They attempted to, she corrected. That's different. She explained my options, my rights, the difference between assumed authority and documented authority. And then she said something that stayed with me. Families often confuse compliance with consent. I left her office with copies of statutes highlighted and a clear sense of direction. I didn't contact my parents. I didn't confront Elise. I sent one email to Whitman Coastal Holdings. Subject: request for documentation. Professional. Neutral. Precise. I requested copies of all amendments, approvals, and governance changes enacted in the past 6 months. I CC'd their attorney. The response came within an hour from my father. We need to talk. I stared at the screen. For the first time since that dinner, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not because I was winning, but because the silence they'd relied on was gone. And they knew it. They talked first, not to me. Around me. I found out the same way I always did, through subtle shifts and incomplete sentences. An email copied one too many times. A phone call that ended abruptly when I entered the room during a family video chat. A cousin who suddenly asked if I was doing okay, in a tone that suggested concern, had already been preloaded. The story was being shaped without me, again. This time, I noticed faster. My father didn't respond to my documentation request directly. Instead, the company attorney sent a brief message acknowledging receipt and asking for additional time to compile materials. That phrasing mattered. Additional time meant scrambling. 2 days later, Elise called. Not texted. Called. That alone was unusual. Nora, she said, her voice light, practiced. Dad says things escalated faster than he expected. I waited. He feels blindsided, she continued. Like you're treating him like an adversary. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the city outside my office window. Gray skies, late winter, everything muted. He made unilateral changes to a company I'm a member of, I said. That's not a misunderstanding. Well, she said carefully, you've always said you didn't want to be involved long-term. I thought back. What I'd actually said over the years was that I didn't want to move back to Charleston, that I liked my job, that I was comfortable where I was. They'd translated that into permission. I never said I didn't want a voice, I replied. There was a pause. A real one this time. I think you're taking this personally, Elise said. I almost laughed. I think you're avoiding it entirely, I said. She sighed. We're family. That didn't stop you, I said quietly. She didn't ask what I meant, which told me everything. The documents arrived the following week. Incomplete. Amendments referenced but not attached. Meeting minutes summarized but unsigned. Decisions dated but not voted on. Dana reviewed them with clinical calm. This is sloppy, she said. And sloppy is dangerous when someone's paying attention. What's the next move? I asked. She didn't answer right away. She flipped through a page, then another. Before we move forward, she said, I need to ask you something. I looked up. Do you want to fix this? She asked. Or do you want to expose it? The question landed harder than I expected. Fixing it meant restoring my position quietly. A correction. An apology, maybe. Things going back to the way they were, with me firmly back in the background. Exposing it meant friction. Oversight. Consequences. A version of events my family couldn't control. I want it documented, I said after a moment. All of it. Dana nodded. Then we proceed formally. That afternoon, she filed a demand for compliance under state LLC law, a request for full records, notarized meeting minutes, and proof of unanimous consent for governance changes. The letter went out certified. My phone rang less than an hour later. My mother. Her voice was tight, brittle around the edges. Nora, she said, what are you doing? I'm asking for records, I replied. You're humiliating your father, she snapped. That's not my intent, I said. Transparency usually feels humiliating to people who rely on secrecy. She inhaled sharply. This is not how we handle things, she said. This is how you handled things, I corrected. I'm responding. There was silence on the line. Then, quieter. You didn't need to involve lawyers. You involved lawyers when you changed the operating agreement, I said. You just didn't tell me. Her voice dropped. We did what we thought was best. For whom? I asked. She didn't answer. By the end of the week, Aaron reached out. My older brother rarely contacted me directly. He preferred intermediaries. Smoother that way. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said. Dad's under a lot of stress. So am I replied. You're risking the business, he continued. And for what? Pride? For consent, I said. Those aren't the same thing. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. You always had a chip on your shoulder. I thought about that after the call ended. A chip implied something unearned. This wasn't that. This was years of quiet accumulation. By early March, the tone shifted again. Emails became colder, more formal. My parents stopped calling entirely. Everything went through the attorney now. Dana flagged something else during her review. There's a refinancing application in progress, she said, using the coastal properties as collateral. My stomach tightened. Was I notified? I asked. No, she said. And you should have been. The timing made sense now. They weren't just consolidating control. They were leveraging it. I thought back to the engagement dinner, the seating chart, the downgrade, the sudden urgency. They hadn't sidelined me because I was inconvenient. They'd sidelined me because I was inconveniently necessary. That night, I sent one more email. Short, direct. I requested a halt on all refinancing activity until governance disputes were resolved. Dana CC'd the lender. The response was immediate. A meeting request, mandatory attendance. For the first time, they weren't just asking to talk, they were being forced to. I closed my laptop and sat back. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was the moment the imbalance became visible. And once that happens, nothing stays quiet for long. The meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning at 9 sharp. Neutral location, corporate offices downtown. Glass walls and polished floors meant to signal professionalism and control. The kind of place where people believed emotion could be managed if the lighting was right. I arrived early, not out of nerves, out of habit. My parents arrived together. My father in his usual navy suit, my mother carrying a leather folder she clutched too tightly. Aaron followed a few minutes later, phone still in hand, irritation already written across his face. Elise came last, alone, her expression unreadable. The lender's representative, a woman named Cynthia Bell, sat at the head of the table. Dana was beside me, calm and observant, her presence a quiet anchor. Cynthia began without ceremony. There's a discrepancy we need to address before proceeding with refinancing, she said, specifically regarding member consent. My father straightened. This is an internal family matter. It became a financial one when collateral was involved. Cynthia replied evenly. Dana slid a document across the table. This is the operating agreement signed at formation, she said. It requires unanimous approval for any material change affecting assets or debt. Cynthia nodded, which we did not receive. The silence that followed felt heavy but contained, like pressure behind glass. My father turned toward me then, his voice low. You could have come to us first. I did, I said, repeatedly. Over years. That's not fair, my mother interjected. We always included you. I didn't respond. Dana did. Inclusion without authority is not inclusion, she said. It's delegation. Cynthia leaned forward. Until this dispute is resolved, refinancing is suspended. Aaron exhaled sharply. Elise's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. This affects timelines, my father said. Deals. That's correct, Cynthia said. Which is why governance clarity is essential. The meeting ended abruptly after that. No resolution. Just consequences. In the hallway afterward, my mother grabbed my arm. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling between anger and panic. Why are you doing this now? I looked at her hand on my sleeve and gently stepped back. I want what I was already entitled to, I said. And I'm doing it now because I finally understand the cost of waiting. Elise spoke then. Quietly, you're tearing the family apart. I met her gaze. The family fractured when decisions started being made without everyone. She looked away. That afternoon, the fallout began. My phone lit up with messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. Concern, confusion. Finley veiled judgment. What's going on? Your parents are stressed. You don't want regrets. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I asked Dana the question that had been circling my mind. What happens if they keep pushing? She didn't hesitate. Then we escalate, she said. Formally. The escalation came sooner than expected. 2 days later, a notice arrived from Whitman Coastal Holdings' attorney. They were petitioning to appoint a managing member to bypass deadlock. Me. They wanted to legally sideline me. I stared at the document for a long time, not because I was surprised, because I was impressed. It was bold, risky, desperate. Dana's response was immediate. "They've overplayed their hand," she said. "This opens them up to court oversight." "Do we want that?" I asked. She looked at me carefully. "Do you want this to stop?" I thought of the seating chart, the downgraded access, the years of silent compliance. "No," I said. "I want it to end properly." She smiled slightly. "Then we file opposition and request accounting." The hearing was set for mid-April. Until then, everything went quiet again. No calls, no texts, no attempts at reconciliation, just lawyers and paper. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I gathered everything: emails, logs, messages, evidence of decisions made without notice, patterns of exclusion framed as efficiency. The more I compiled, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't personal animosity. It was convenience. I was useful until I wasn't. Necessary until I asked to be acknowledged. The night before the hearing, I slept soundly. That surprised me. In the courtroom the next morning, my family sat on one side. I sat on the other. My father didn't look at me. The judge listened patiently as arguments were made, as narratives were spun, as intent was debated. Then Dana stood. She didn't talk about feelings. She talked about law, about consent, about fiduciary duty, about the difference between managing and controlling, about me. The judge asked questions, took notes, reviewed documents, and then said the words that shifted everything. Petition denied. He ordered a full accounting, independent oversight, a freeze on any unilateral actions until compliance was verified. My mother's face drained of color. Erin stared at the floor. Elise closed her eyes. Outside the courthouse, my father finally spoke to me. "You didn't have to do this." I met his gaze, steady. "I didn't," I said. "You did. I just stopped pretending otherwise." As I walked away, I felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, relief. Because the quiet war was over, and the truth was finally on record. The accounting process was slower than I expected, not because the records were complicated, because they were revealing. Independent auditors don't rush when they sense imbalance. They read carefully. They compare versions. They ask questions that don't sound accusatory, but feel surgical to the people who thought they'd never be asked at all. The first request went out 3 days after the hearing. Full transaction histories, internal communications tied to asset decisions, documentation for reimbursements, transfers, and intercompany loans. My father forwarded the request to the family email thread with a single line: "This is unnecessary." No one replied. That silence told me everything. In the weeks that followed, my role changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just a sideline daughter anymore. I was a named party in an active oversight process. That meant information flowed to me automatically. For the first time, I wasn't asking to be included. I was required. The first inconsistency surfaced in late April. A maintenance expense logged to one of the Hilton Head properties. $10,000. Vaguely described. Approved without secondary sign-off. Dana flagged it. "Do you recognize this vendor?" she asked. I shook my head. No. And I would have. I vetted most of them. The auditor requested clarification. The response came 2 days later. It was a personal account my father controlled, labeled as reimbursement. I didn't react outwardly. Inside, something settled. This wasn't about efficiency, or pressure, or family dynamics. This was about access. The more the auditors dug, the clearer the pattern became. Small transfers, rounded numbers, payments routed through accounts that technically fell within authority, but only if no one else was watching. Nothing criminal, not yet, but inappropriate and very quiet. When my mother finally called, her voice was tight with restraint. "They're digging into everything," she said. "This is humiliating." "They're doing their job," I replied. "You wanted this," she said. "I wanted transparency," I said. This is what it looks like. There was a long pause. Then she said something I hadn't expected. We were protecting the family. I closed my eyes. From what? I asked. From instability, she said. From outside influence. From change. I thought about that after the call ended. Change. That was the threat. Not me. By May, word had spread. Extended family started distancing themselves from my parents. Invitations shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when they entered rooms. The same people who once praised my father's leadership now spoke in careful tones. I watched all of it from a distance, not because I was afraid, because I no longer needed proximity to feel relevant. Elise reached out once during that time. I didn't know, she said quietly when we spoke. About the reimbursements, about the accounts. I believe you, I said. She sounded surprised. You do? Yes, I said. Because you didn't need to know to benefit from the system. She was silent. I'm not angry, I continued. I'm just done pretending ignorance equals innocence. The auditors issued their interim report in early June. They found procedural violations, conflicts of interest, governance failures. They recommended restructuring, shared authority, third-party management, clear separation between personal and business finances. In other words, the system my parents had resisted for years. The judge approved the recommendations. Just like that, the control they'd guarded so carefully dissolved into oversight and structure. My parents didn't fight it. They couldn't. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights low, documents spread across the table. I thought about the version of myself who would have once felt guilty for this, who would have apologized, backed down, tried to make it easier for everyone else. She would have believed that preserving peace mattered more than preserving herself. She was wrong. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. The most destabilizing thing you can do to a system built on silence is insist on documentation. Because paper doesn't care who raised you, and truth doesn't need permission. By summer, the family business no longer felt like a family business. That was the point. The restructuring moved quickly once the court approved it. A third-party management firm stepped in. Authority was redistributed. Reporting lines were clarified. Decisions that once happened over dinners and private calls now required agendas, votes, and minutes. Everything had a paper trail. My parents hated that. They didn't say it directly. They didn't need to. It showed in the way my father stopped attending optional meetings, in the way my mother forwarded emails without comment instead of adding her usual annotations, in the way they both spoke less and less, as if volume itself had been a form of power they were slowly losing. Aaron reacted differently. He became charming. He called more often, asked how work was going, sent articles he thought I'd find interesting. He framed it as concern, as reconnection. I recognized it immediately. Damage control. You know, he said during one call, none of this had to get so public. It wasn't public, I replied. It was documented. You're splitting hairs. No, I said calmly. You're conflating discomfort with exposure. He laughed softly. You always were dramatic. I didn't respond. A week later, Dana forwarded me an email from the auditors. There was another issue. A shell entity I hadn't known about. Registered out of state, used briefly 2 years earlier to hold title on a short-term acquisition, then dissolved. Except it hadn't been fully dissolved, and funds had moved through it. Again, nothing illegal on its own, but the pattern was undeniable. When I confronted my parents about it, not together but separately, the reactions were telling. My mother cried, not loudly, not theatrically, just enough to suggest pain without accountability. We trusted your father to handle those things, she said. I didn't want to know the details. That's not a defense, I said gently. It's a delegation. My father didn't cry. He grew cold. You're turning this into something it isn't, he said. We built that business. You're treating us like criminals. I'm treating you like fiduciaries, I replied. He looked at me then. Really looked, as if seeing a stranger. I don't recognize you, he said. That's because you never needed to, I said. Until now. That was the last personal conversation we had for months. Elise kept her distance. Not out of hostility, out of confusion. She had grown up believing the system worked because it was fair. Now she was being forced to see that it worked because no one questioned it. That realization takes time. By August, the auditors issued their final report. It was thorough, neutral, unemotional. It concluded that while there was no evidence of criminal intent, there was a consistent pattern of exclusionary governance and informal financial practices that disadvantaged one member, me. Seeing that in writing was strangely grounding. It wasn't validation. I didn't need that anymore. It was confirmation. The court ordered one final measure, a buyout option. Any member could exit under fair market valuation, independently assessed. The room went very quiet when that was announced. My parents assumed I would take it, that I would walk away with a check and disappear. They underestimated me. Again, I didn't want out. I wanted balance. I exercised my option differently. I offered to buy a portion of their shares. Not all. Enough. Enough to change the math. Dana raised an eyebrow when I told her. This will escalate things, she said. I know, I replied. But it will also end them. The negotiations were tense. Lawyers did most of the talking. My parents resisted at first, then hesitated, then conceded, because the alternative was worse. Oversight without influence. In September, the papers were signed. I became a majority voting member, not because I'd schemed, because I'd stayed. When the confirmation came through, I sat in my car for a long time without turning the engine on. I thought about the engagement dinner, the seating chart, the word flexible. They had assumed I would always bend. They had never considered that bending has a limit. When I finally drove home, my phone buzzed with a message from Aaron. So you won. I stared at it. No, I typed back. I stabilized. He didn't reply. That night, I slept deeply. Not because everything was resolved, but because the ground under me finally felt solid. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to decisions made about me. I was making them. And that changed everything. Power doesn't announce itself when it shifts. It settles, quietly, permanently. Like weight redistributing after a long imbalance. The weeks after the buyout were strangely calm. No dramatic fallout, no explosive arguments. Just an absence where authority used to live. The third-party management firm took control without hesitation. Meetings followed agendas now. Decisions were documented. My parents attended less and spoke even less. When they did, it was carefully, as if every word needed to be weighed before it was allowed into the room. They weren't used to that. Neither was Aaron. He tried one last time to pull me aside, this time under the pretense of reconciliation. We met for coffee near his office, a place he'd chosen deliberately. Familiar territory, subtle advantage. You didn't have to go this far, he said, stirring his drink though it had already cooled. You could have just asked for more recognition. I asked for consent, I replied. Recognition was never the issue. You embarrassed Mom and Dad, he said. People are talking. People were always talking, I said. I just wasn't allowed to hear it before. He leaned back, studying me. You don't care how this looks. I care how it works, I said. There's a difference. That was when he said something revealing. You've changed the rules. No, I said. I've followed them. You just didn't think they applied to you. He didn't argue after that, because there was nothing left to argue with. By October, the first real consequence surfaced. A property sale my father had been negotiating quietly fell through. The buyer backed out after reviewing the new governance disclosures. Too many eyes now. Too many checks. My father called me that evening. Not to accuse, to inform. They're nervous, he said, about the oversight. That's normal, I replied. Transparency does that. They wouldn't have hesitated before, he said. That's why we're here, I answered. The call ended without resolution. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation. Control thrives in shadows. It weakens in daylight. Elise reached out again around that time. I don't know where I fit anymore, she admitted when we spoke. Everything feels different. It is different, I said, and it will keep changing. She hesitated. Do you regret it? I thought carefully before answering. No, I said, but I regret how long I waited. She was quiet. I didn't think it mattered, she said finally. Who signed what? Who decided things? It matters when you're the one being decided for, I replied. That conversation didn't fix anything, but it shifted something. At work, my confidence had sharpened. I spoke more directly, set boundaries faster. declined meetings that existed only to soothe egos. People noticed, not negatively. They adjusted. I realized then how much of my earlier restraint had been learned at home. Be agreeable. Don't disrupt. Let others decide. Those habits don't stay contained. They bleed. In November, the management firm scheduled a strategic review. Long-term planning, asset reallocation, risk mitigation. I chaired the meeting. Not ceremonially, practically. My parents attended virtually, cameras off. When votes were taken, they abstained. Not out of protest, out of resignation. Afterward, Dana called. "You handled that well," she said. "I handled it the way it should have been handled, from the beginning," I replied. She paused. "You know this isn't over, right?" "I know," I said, "but it's no longer unstable." That was the difference. The final break came quietly, the way most real endings do. Thanksgiving approached. My mother sent a group message. Same phrasing as every year. Same assumptions. I didn't respond. Neither did Aaron. Elise sent a private message later. "I'm not coming either," she wrote. I stared at that for a long moment. Not because it felt like loyalty, because it felt like consequence. People were choosing now. Not out of obligation, out of awareness. On Thanksgiving morning, I cooked for myself. Nothing elaborate, just enough. As I ate alone, I thought about how many years I'd believed being included meant being loved. I understood now how wrong that was. Inclusion without voice is containment. Love without choice is control. That afternoon, I received an email from the management firm. A proposal for next year. Growth, stability, clear margins. They asked for my input. They waited for my response. I closed my laptop and sat back. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is reactive, loud, temporary. This was something else. This was the long arc of correction. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of where it might lead. Because wherever it went next, I would arrive there by choice. December arrived without ceremony. No invitations. No expectations. No subtle reminders disguised as tradition. For the first time in years, my calendar wasn't pre-filled with obligations I hadn't agreed to. I noticed the absence the way you notice quiet after a storm. At first, it feels unnatural. Then, it feels earned. The management firm sent year-end summaries, clean numbers, predictable outcomes, no surprises buried in footnotes. Stability had a rhythm. My parents didn't call. That should have hurt. Instead, it clarified something I hadn't fully accepted yet. Our relationship had always depended on my availability, my willingness to absorb discomfort so others didn't have to. Without that, there was nothing to maintain. Aaron tried again, just before Christmas. He framed it as concern. "Mom's not taking this well," he said. "She feels like she's losing her family." I listened without interrupting. "She says you've iced her out," he continued, "that you've changed." "I changed my behavior," I said. "Her reaction isn't my responsibility." "That's cold," he said. "No," I replied. "It's accurate." He sighed. "You always had a way of making things sound reasonable." "I learned it from Dad," I said. That ended the call. On Christmas Eve, I received an email from my mother, longer than usual, carefully worded. She talked about traditions, about how families endure by compromising, about forgiveness, about how she didn't recognize this version of me. She didn't mention the LLC, or the auditors, or the buyout. She didn't mention the choices she'd made. I read it once. Then I archived it. Not deleted. Archived. Because denial doesn't disappear just because you stop engaging with it. I spent Christmas Day alone again. Not lonely, just quiet. I cooked a simple meal, took a long walk, let the day pass without narrating it to anyone. That night, I thought about something Dana had said months earlier. People mistake access for entitlement. My parents had always believed access to me was guaranteed, that they could step in and out of my life without consequence. Now, they were learning otherwise. In January, the management firm flagged a new issue, a tenant dispute. Minor. Routine. They asked if I wanted to handle it or delegate. That question stopped me for a moment. No one had ever asked before. "I'll handle it," I said, and I did. Efficiently, fairly, with documentation and restraint. The tenant thanked me. That mattered. More than it should have. It reminded me that authority doesn't need to dominate to be effective. It just needs to be present. Elise called a week later. "I think I'm ready to talk," she said. We met at a cafe halfway between our homes. Neutral ground again. It had become a pattern. She looked tired. Not distressed, just worn down in a way people get when their assumptions collapse. "I didn't see it," she said. "How the system worked." "I know," I replied. "I thought you were choosing distance," she continued. "I didn't realize you were being pushed there." I waited. "I benefited from that," she said quietly, "from not having to see it." "Yes," I said. "You did." She nodded. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect, but it was real." "I'm not asking for things to go back," she added quickly. "I just want to understand how to move forward without repeating it." That was new. "We move forward slowly," I said, "with clarity and no assumptions." She agreed. We didn't hug when we left. We didn't need to. In February, my father sent me a document. No message attached, just a file. It was a revised estate plan. I read it carefully. My name was included. Formally, clearly, equitably. It was the first time he'd acknowledged, on paper, that I existed outside of convenience. I didn't respond. Not because it wasn't significant, because significance doesn't require acknowledgement to exist. Dana reviewed it when I sent it to her. "He's correcting course," she said. "Too late," I replied. She studied me. "Not for him, for you." That stayed with me. By early spring, the family business no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like infrastructure, something functional, something neutral. The drama had drained out of it, and with it, much of my family's leverage. I realized then that what they'd feared wasn't exposure, it was irrelevance. They'd built authority by being indispensable, by controlling access, by positioning themselves as the only ones who could hold things together. Once structure replaced them, they didn't know where to stand. That wasn't my problem to solve. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing reports, I thought back to the person I'd been when this started. The one who believed patience would eventually be rewarded, that being low maintenance made you lovable, that silence was maturity. She hadn't been wrong. She'd just been incomplete. This version of me wasn't louder or colder. She was finished asking, and that made all the difference. March brought a different kind of tension, not explosive, not urgent, administrative. It began with a letter, not from my parents, not from Aaron or Elise, from an attorney I didn't recognize, representing a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. A cousin on my mother's side, someone who'd always been polite at holidays and invisible the rest of the time. The letter requested clarification about ownership, about voting rights, about future distributions. It was careful, non-accusatory, almost deferential, but I recognized the tone. Someone had whispered in the background. Dana read it once and set it down. "They're probing." "For what?" I asked. "For weakness," she said. Or an opening. She was right. When systems change, people who benefited from the old one get restless. They test the edges, hoping to reclaim something before it fully settles. This wasn't about money. It was about hierarchy. I responded formally, providing only what was required. No reassurance, no context, just facts. The reply never came, but the ripple did. A week later, I was invited to a family birthday dinner. Not Elise's, not mine, my mother's. The invitation came through a group text. Casual, presumptive. Same restaurant, same phrasing, as always. I stared at it longer than I needed to. Then I replied, "I won't be attending. Wishing you a good evening." No explanation. No apology. The response was immediate. My mother called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "You don't have to punish us forever," she said. "This has gone far enough." Punish. That word again. I deleted the message. Not because it hurt. Because it was inaccurate. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was opting out. At work, something else shifted. I was offered a leadership role. Interim at first, then permanent. More responsibility. More authority. The timing wasn't accidental. People sense when someone stops negotiating their own position. I accepted without hesitation. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, offer letter folded neatly on the table, I felt a flicker of something unexpected. Grief. Not for what I'd lost, for what I'd normalized. The years of minimizing myself, so others could remain comfortable. The quiet compromises that accumulated into invisibility. Grief doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from clarity. In April, the court-appointed oversight officially concluded. Final report filed. Compliance confirmed. No further monitoring required. Dana called me when it was done. "You're free," she said. "I was free before," I replied. "This just makes it official." She laughed softly. "Most people don't realize that until the paperwork's done." That evening, Elise texted. "I think Mom's planning something," she wrote. "A reset. She wants us all together." I stared at the message. Then I typed, "I won't participate in ambushes disguised as reconciliation." There was a long pause. "I understand," Elise replied. That was new. Understanding without persuasion. In May, my father finally asked to meet. Just the two of us. I considered it carefully before agreeing. We met in a quiet cafe near the harbor. He arrived early, looking older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. "I didn't handle things well," he said after a few minutes. I waited. "I thought if I kept control, everything would stay stable," he continued. "I didn't see how much I was excluding you." I nodded once. "You saw. You just didn't think it mattered." He winced slightly. Maybe. There was no apology, no self-flagellation, just acknowledgement. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said, "to how things were." "Good," I replied. "Neither am I." We sat in silence for a moment. "I hope you know," he said quietly. "You didn't destroy the family." I looked at him. "I know," I said. "I just refused to disappear for it." When we parted, I felt no rush of emotion. No relief, no closure, just confirmation. By early summer, the story had stopped unfolding, which is how I knew it was ending. No new threats, no new maneuvers, no hidden agendas surfacing in the margins. The system had stabilized, and so had I. One evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the city soften into dusk. I thought about the idea of revenge, how people imagine it loud and dramatic. This hadn't been that. There were no raised voices, no public confrontations, no declarations, just structure, boundaries, documentation, and the quiet understanding that control only works when everyone agrees to participate in it. I didn't. And once I stopped, the entire system had to adjust. That wasn't vengeance. That was consequence. By June, the quiet had settled into something durable. Not the fragile calm that follows an argument. Not the brittle peace that depends on everyone pretending nothing happened. This was different. This was the absence of pressure. The family stopped reaching out all at once. Not intentionally, I think. More like they ran out of reasons that worked. Without emergencies or leverage, there was nothing to pull me back into orbit. And for the first time, I noticed how much of our contact had always been transactional. I received a call from the management firm one Tuesday afternoon. Routine update. Minor vote needed on a lease extension. They didn't rush me. They didn't frame it as urgent. They trusted my judgment. When I approved the extension, the process was seamless. Recorded, confirmed, done. No drama. I sat back afterward, surprised by how anticlimactic competence could feel when no one was undermining it. That same week, my mother sent another message. Shorter this time. "We're thinking of selling the old house, the one on the marsh. The one where every Thanksgiving had been held, where photos lined the staircase, charting a version of our family that only existed when framed correctly." I stared at the message longer than necessary, then replied, "I hope the process goes smoothly. No questions, no offers to help." Her response came an hour later. "I thought you'd want to know." I almost typed back, "I already do." Instead, I said nothing. Letting go isn't loud. It's selective. In July, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from the estate attorney who drafted my grandmother's will. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He wrote to inform me of a clarification filed posthumously, something procedural that had been delayed and only recently processed. I read it carefully. It confirmed something Dana had suspected months earlier. My grandmother had anticipated conflict. She'd included a clause allowing any excluded beneficiary to request independent review of family-held assets tied to her estate, regardless of subsequent restructuring. It hadn't been used before, because no one had needed to, except me. I forwarded the letter to Dana. She called immediately. "This strengthens your position," she said. "Not legally. You're already solid. But narratively. Narratively for whom? I asked. For anyone still pretending this was personal, she replied. It wasn't. It was foreseeable. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the letter folded neatly in front of me. I thought about my grandmother, about how little she spoke, how closely she watched. She'd never interfered directly. She'd just left a door unlocked. In August, Elise invited me to lunch again, not to discuss the business, not to mediate anything, just lunch. We talked about work, about her plans, about small, ordinary things. Halfway through, she said quietly, I didn't realize how much I relied on them making decisions. I know, I said. I thought it was care, she admitted. I see now, it was control. I didn't correct her. Because realization works best when it isn't rushed. When we parted, she hugged me briefly, awkwardly, but without tension. That mattered. At work, my interim role became permanent. The announcement went out company-wide. Congratulatory messages filled my inbox. I read them slowly, not because I needed affirmation, because I was noticing something new. I wasn't shrinking to make the moment easier for anyone else. I accepted the congratulations. I thanked people. I allowed the recognition to exist without deflecting it. That was new. In September, my father emailed me again. No subject line, just a sentence. I see now why you couldn't stay quiet. I read it twice, then replied. I wasn't built to disappear. He didn't respond, and I didn't need him to. One evening later that month, I was asked to speak at a small industry panel. Governance, ethics, quiet power. As I spoke, I realized I wasn't telling a story anymore. I was describing a framework, one that didn't depend on family roles or approval or proximity, just clarity. When I left the event, someone stopped me in the hallway. Your perspective felt lived in, she said. Like you've been on the other side of bad systems. I have, I replied. And I learned something important there. What's that? She asked. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth had taken a long time to earn. Systems don't fail because people are emotional, I said. They fail because too many people benefit from silence. That night, as I walked home, the city warm and alive around me, I felt something settle that I hadn't expected. Not victory, finality. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. By October, my family had become background noise. Not absent, not erased, just no longer central. That distinction mattered more than I expected. The management firm sent a quarterly update. Performance steady. Risk reduced. Governance functioning as designed. They asked if I wanted to attend the annual review in person or virtually. I chose virtual. Not because I was avoiding anything, because I didn't need to prove presence anymore. Around the same time, Aaron resurfaced. He emailed instead of calling, which already told me he was being careful. I'm thinking of stepping away from the business, he wrote. I want to explore other opportunities. I read the message slowly. There was no accusation in it, no attempt to guilt me. Just a statement that sounded like retreat. Good luck, I replied. I hope you find something that fits. His response came hours later. That's it? That's it, I confirmed. The old version of me would have asked questions, offered support, tried to manage his transition so no one felt abandoned. This version understood something different. Other people's exits are not your responsibility. Later that month, my mother sent me a package, no note. Inside was a photo album. Childhood pictures, vacations, holidays. Carefully curated memories. I flipped through it once, then I put it back in the box. Memory isn't reconciliation, it's context, and context doesn't undo harm. I didn't return the album. I didn't display it, either. It sat on a shelf, unopened, where it belonged. In November, the old house sold, the one on the marsh. The buyer was a young family. I saw the listing photos online. Fresh paint, staging, erased traces of us. I felt nothing, which surprised me. I'd expected sadness, nostalgia, something. Instead, I felt closure. Not because the house was gone, because it no longer held me. Elise called the night before Thanksgiving. I'm not going home, she said. I'm traveling instead. Where? I asked. Somewhere neutral, she replied. I need space to think. That sounds healthy, I said. She hesitated. Do you ever miss it? How it used to be? I considered the question carefully. I miss what I thought it was, I said. Not what it actually was. She was quiet. Thank you, she said finally. For not forcing anything. I'm not forcing, I replied. I'm choosing. That Thanksgiving, I hosted friends instead. People who knew pieces of my story, but never demanded the whole thing. We ate. We laughed. We didn't perform gratitude for survival. At the table, I realized something subtle but profound. I wasn't scanning the room for approval. I wasn't monitoring tone or timing or perception. I was present. In December, Dana called with a final update. The case file is officially closed, she said. No pending matters. No loose ends. Thank you, I said. You did the hard part, she replied. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. The story that had once dominated my life was now just finished. Not resolved in the way people imagine, but complete. That night, I wrote something down in a notebook I'd kept through all of this. Not for evidence, for myself. I wrote, "Control masquerades as care until you stop complying. Then it reveals itself." I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf beside the unopened photo album. 2 records of the same family. Only one told the truth. The last decision I made about my family didn't involve a lawyer, a meeting, or a document. It happened quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday, while I was standing in my kitchen waiting for water to boil. My phone buzzed with a notification. A group text. Family Christmas planning. Same structure as always. Same assumptions. Same expectation that silence meant consent. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I muted the thread. Not dramatically, not angrily, deliberately. And just like that, it was done. Nothing collapsed. No one called in a panic. The world didn't end. Which was the point. By then, my life no longer revolved around reacting to what my family did or didn't do. Work had found its rhythm. Leadership suited me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Friends knew where I stood and didn't ask me to soften it. Even the business had become boring in the best possible way. Quarterly reports, predictable outcomes, clear lines of authority. Fairness, I learned, is often indistinguishable from quiet. My parents reached out once more before the year ended. A neutral message. Polite. Distant. "We hope you're well." I replied with the truth. "I am." That was all. No reopening. No invitations. Just fact. On New Year's Eve, I sat alone on my balcony, the city lit softly below. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of all this. The one who believed that being patient would eventually earn safety. That if she stayed reasonable, she'd be protected. She hadn't been foolish. She'd just been trained. Trained to accept decisions without question. Trained to confuse loyalty with obedience. Trained to believe that love required erasure. The betrayal hadn't been loud. It had been procedural. A series of small exclusions disguised as efficiency. A gradual removal of choice, framed as concern. A family that learned how much it could take because I never said no. Until I did. The turning point wasn't the courtroom, or the auditors, or the buyout. It was the moment I stopped explaining myself. The moment I realized that I didn't need to be understood to be right. Didn't need agreement to set boundaries. Didn't need approval to protect what was mine. I chose structure over sentiment, clarity over comfort, myself over a role I never agreed to play. And yes, there was karma. Not the cinematic kind. No shouting, no downfall, just consequences. A system that relied on silence couldn't survive daylight. Authority built on exclusion weakened once consent was required. People who mistook access for entitlement learned what happens when access is revoked. The tables didn't flip, they turned. If you're listening to this and seeing parts of your own life reflected back at you, remember this. You are not difficult for asking questions. You are not disloyal for setting boundaries. And you are not selfish for choosing yourself when no one else will. Family drama doesn't always end with reconciliation. Sometimes it ends with clarity, and that is enough. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, or subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And if you've ever been excluded, silenced, or quietly pushed aside by the people who should have protected you, know this. You didn't imagine it. You weren't wrong. And it's not too late to choose yourself.